Hi everyone, my name is Denise Welch and I'm the founder of HealthMedWearables.com. Our guest today is Patrick Hankey from Medidata. Welcome, Patrick.
Thank you, Denise. It's a pleasure to be here.
Our talk today is going to be centered around how wearable tech and pharma companies are beginning to work together to bring about faster, more reliable testing, thus in turn moving clinical trials and FDA approval to a faster level of processing and completion. What impact will this have on the consumer, on the healthcare professional, and the pharmaceutical industry is our conversation for today. So if we'd like to begin, Patrick, I'd just like to have you give us a little background of yourself and tell us how you became involved with Medidata.
Thank you, Denise. My name is Patrick Hankey, and I am a research scientist by training. I am a strategic consultant at Medidata and work within our mHealth team, which is the team tasked with deploying wearables and sensors and apps in the clinical trial arena.
And so what is your role with Medidata pertaining to the health and medical wearables at this point?
Yes, so as a little bit of background, I've actually been deploying and commercializing wearable sensors for 14 years now in total. So it's been my pleasure to actually see real-life deployments of sensors on just about every patient population you can think of, from little babies and preemies to astronauts on the International Space Station. And so my main point of contact with clients, or my first point of contact, is really to start that conversation about the types of wearables that they might wish to deploy in their clinical trial or in their healthcare setting. Really to walk them through the choices that are out there in the industry, and there are a tremendous and growing number of choices, but also to take them to the data and analytics conversation that's very much a follow-up to the sensor selection conversation. So I want to help with how the clients think about data and analytics, development of new algorithms, and really using the data to its greatest potential.
Wonderful. And so can we back up just a little bit, and can you maybe give our audience just a little brief introduction to what a wearable technology device really is all about?
Well, that is a great question, and you'll notice that when I talk about these things, I talk about wearable sensors. And I use the word sensor essentially to differentiate medical sensors from so-called medical devices. If you want to think of a hip replacement is a medical device, but it's not sensing anything on the body. Whereas if we place even an activity tracker or a cardiorespiratory monitor on an individual, we are capturing or sensing physiological data coming from the patient. And so I always talk about wearable sensors, and that is something that is sensing some kind of metric from an individual and is also something that we would place next to the skin and envisage that it would be worn for a considerable period of time. It may be a short period of time, but often the wearables that we're tasked with deploying are going to be deployed and placed on a person for weeks, if not months at a time.
Okay, and so you're talking a lot about sensors. So would you say that has been the advancement of these wearables, is the technology behind the sensors that's driving this, or do you believe it's just the wearables in general that have come to the forefront that are helping people to utilize them in that capacity of data collecting?
Well, that's a great question, and really where the technology has been and where it's going to is a very exciting conversation. As I've said, I've been in the industry now deploying sensors for longer than I care to remember, 14 years. And so in some senses, the technology is not new. However, obviously with miniaturization and improvements in batteries and data storage, these sensors have become more and more capable, and also they've become smaller and smaller and less obtrusive and easier to wear. The one interesting thing, though, is that one of the real advances that is assisted in the deployment of wearable sensors is the ability to actually transmit the data from the wearer to a cloud infrastructure or to a physician or somebody who's going to view that data or analyze that data. So the networks and the ability to push data around has evolved considerably in that 14-year period. I mean, we've gone from very dumb phones to very smartphones, and so we have the ability to easily move the data around in a secure and compliant fashion. The one interesting thing that has remained rather constant, however, in this marketplace over the time that I've seen it is that the measures that we're actually getting from people have not really changed. I mean, we still really want blood pressure, we want to look at EKG perhaps, we want to look at activity, we want to look at sleep. And those measures, or our ability to take those measures, has been around for quite some time. The other huge advance that we're really in the process of making too is the ability to apply very advanced algorithms to look at those data, very long periods of data, in a more and more automated fashion, and really to hone in on the signals amongst perhaps the noise, you might say, that we're getting from sensors.
Wow. Just trying to apply wearable technology to just healthcare as just one entity seems rather overwhelming, particularly because we have dealt with data with healthcare for so long, and now what we're talking about is this humongous amount of data that seems to be able to be collected by these wearables. What are we going to do with all of that in the healthcare industry?
Well, that is the big question. Absolutely, it is one thing to collect the data, but it's another thing to understand it. But also, in a sense, we are still, as I mentioned previously, we're still capturing the same kind of information, and often we think of wearables as collecting continuous data, but also wearables can be used to just collect one blood pressure reading a day, just a very small period of activity in a day, or to record a change in weight or a change in temperature. So yes, we have classes of sophisticated sensors that produce very, very large data sets, but also healthcare settings are interested in discrete periods of data, as I said, blood pressure or temperature or weight changes. And so the data can be very complex or it can be relatively simple. And just our ability to collect even simple data once or twice a day is much better than the weeks that normally transpire between visits in a healthcare setting.
So let's take a moment and let's just kind of move over to the pharmaceutical side. There's a lot of talk going on with the pharmaceutical industry and wearables. How are they viewing the wearable industry at this point?
So the pharmaceutical industry, and it seems that this is really something that's happening. I've seen a dramatic change in it in just the last year. Where I've been out for all of those years knocking on pharma's door and asking them would they like to deploy sensors. Now it seems the pharmaceutical industry, the clinical trials space, has started to really want to collect this data. They are now sensing that they need to be at the forefront of this new data stream, and I think it's fair to say that the companies that are embracing these kinds of technologies are going to be the leaders in the immediate future. So we've seen over the last number of years many pharma companies creating their own innovation teams that have been tasked with looking at these types of technologies. However, now it seems the innovation teams are ready to actually operationalize these studies, and it feels like there are, and I understand that there are a number of industry pressures building in the pharmaceutical industry to actually gather that data, and I'd be happy to kind of discuss that too.
Wow. So if we then look down to the doctors and like that, I know there's a lot of conversation coming from the healthcare professional side. Doctors are complaining right now, stating that they don't want all of this data that is being collected by the wearable technology. They don't have the time to look at it, nor do they have the skills or the understanding, the the education, so to speak, with these wearables. What do you think is going to happen here in the near future? Do you think that they're going to be dragging their feet the whole while, or do you think that they're going to turn around and say, maybe this is a valuable thing for us to start to implement within our practice itself?
Yes, so although I work primarily in the pharmaceutical industry, it's been very interesting to see a parallel track of development in terms of deploying wearable sensors in healthcare settings, and I've been very close to that conversation too. And I really do feel that the medical profession, doctors and caregivers and providers, they really do want to see this data. However, they want to see it in a way that it's truly actionable. So, just giving them piles of data and expecting them to somehow understand it and to contextualize it is sort of one thing, but giving them something like a blood pressure reading every day or a change in weight every day, where they can identify a patient who may be several days away from heart failure or some kind of decompensation, that's the kind of actionable data that a physician can then send a caregiver to that person and to intervene before the situation becomes more critical. So it's really giving the doctors the tools, if you like, to make an intervention. And I think one of the other things that has been not quite a stumbling block in the industry, but another consideration in the healthcare space that's a little unique. No one wants to think of their data going into a black box and somehow an algorithm making a decision about their healthcare. They want to feel that a doctor, a provider has actually viewed that data and then used those rules to actually provide some kind of intervention. And so that's been one of the interesting developments, is seeing the doctors having the ability to set rules within algorithms so that they are the ones deciding, if you don't submit your weight data for 3 days in a row, we have to intervene. And it's actually the physician that's setting that set of rules in a healthcare setting.
That's very interesting. Continuing that conversation, I think it would probably be safe to say, and I'd love to hear your take on this, that there really needs to be a rethinking from the healthcare professional standpoint of how they are going to interact with their patients at this point forward, knowing that this type of data is coming in from the wearable and that there will be actionable things that need to take place. A lot of times people will not see their doctor except for once a year. Do you see that this is going to have a big impact on doctors being more interactive with the patients, coming to bridging that gap together?
Yes, and I think we will have the ability for patients to be much more intensely monitored, if you like, using sensors that fill in the gaps between doctor visits. If those are very long, so be it. But often the patients that we are deploying sensors on are high-touch patients and patients who are under a level of care that is quite intense. And so it gives the ability for the doctor to actually be a little bit more proactive when you're seeing a set of readings going in a certain direction, rather than waiting for the individual to have an actual crisis that you then intervene with.
And so from the consumer side, when do you think that consumers are going to start to really actively take part in wanting and requesting these types of wearable devices that then can be shared with their healthcare professional?
Well, I definitely see we're at that point today. It never ceases to amaze me how many people are actually wearing an activity tracker. I see that you have one on today, and that's generally the case when I go to meetings. People are either voluntarily deciding to be more proactive about their health, and I think a very high value that we can get from just wearing an activity tracker is perhaps less about the activity part of our day, but just the ability to look at our sleep quality and see how we might be able to improve sleep quality, which is a tremendous indicator of overall health. So I think the consumer are really grasping these solutions. They are enthusiastically embracing them.
Would you say that wearables give the patient more control over how they handle their own care?
Yes, to an extent that the patients or the consumers are going to see that data and make decisions around that data. And as I mentioned, just being able to understand your activity day to day and see whether that is headed in a positive direction or a negative direction. And I actually like to say one thing about activity trackers, and that is the two things that activity trackers do very well is they simply look at whether you're more active today than you were the day before and the day before that. And activity is really life, right? If you're inactive, you're not engaged in life. If you're active, you're having a full life. And the other part of that data is sleep data. If you're getting an extra hour, an extra 2 hours sleep a night, you feel fantastic and your quality of life improves. So actually with relatively simple data, the consumer can be made aware of their overall healthcare trajectory. We're also seeing some interesting offerings in the consumer space where providers want to give consumers a little bit more data, and they're interested in providing things like heart rate variability as a measure of a little bit more of a granular measure of their overall healthcare trajectory. So we're seeing some very interesting new offerings very definitely in the consumer space. One other thing that I think is driving the consumer space is actually the healthcare industry, in that I've seen a lot of people, and I'm actually on a plan myself, where the healthcare provider is actually encouraging you to place a wearable on you and to monitor your own activity. And so you're incentivized either monetarily or even by just points on a scale to use an activity tracker or to use a sleep monitor. So we're seeing providers actually be part of this conversation and moving consumers, I think, very much in the right direction.
So let's talk a little bit about some of the wearables that are out there right now. Have you recently seen one that kind of piques your interest and shows promise for, perhaps the healthcare industry? And then perhaps you can choose one for the consumer side and tell me what your take is on one and the other.
Well, I'm not going to endorse a brand for you today, although there are a tremendous number of great brands out there developing in this space. However, I'm going to talk a little bit more broadly about the classes of sensors that we're seeing deployed and how those are a little bit different. In the pharmaceutical industry, we're seeing deployment of what I call high-resolution sensors, where you're looking at something like continuous ECG or continuous measures of complex respiration in asthma and COPD. And so we're seeing a real industry appetite where the pharmaceutical companies are coming and saying, you know what, we want to collect a very large data set. We're comfortable with this being a very complex data set. We're going to analyze it in a lot of detail, and we want to deploy. Often pharmaceutical companies are talking about deploying multiple sensors on one individual, and those are multiple sensors that are collecting multiple channels of data. So we're seeing an increased appetite in pharma for these very complex solutions now being deployed to get very granular information, often about very specific neurological conditions or genetic conditions which are truly being investigated using a new drug or a new paradigm. In the in the wearable consumer space, I think in general we're seeing a huge advance in just the deployment of activity and sleep trackers. I think it's going to be interesting. Many of the consumer-based or consumer-facing wearables are now adding in things like being able to capture heart rate in a relatively unobtrusive way, but also the ability to capture things like galvanic skin response, which is a measure, if you like, of emotional response in people. So we're seeing some very interesting sort of consolidation in the market, in the consumer space, where, you know, there's very broad agreement that it's beneficial for lots of people to be wearing activity and sleep trackers. But also new penetrations into that market with variations on technologies that we have developed in the harder science area. Mm-hmm. So it's more about sort of the classes of sensors that are now being deployed, and generally the appetite for the users, be that the healthcare provider, the pharmaceutical company, or indeed the consumer.
Mm-hmm. And so with all of those types of wearables on the market from various levels and like that, how is the FDA handling all of this? I mean, recently they came out with guidelines for designers and creators, stating that these were the guidelines they needed to follow in order to get FDA clearance, FDA approval. You know, do you think that this is a positive sign of progress with the FDA and wearables as far as coming into the healthcare industry? Or do you think that they're just being pushed because of the modern, you know, fanfare that's going on with these wearables today?
I think the FDA is very excited about the data in the way that the rest of the industry is. I think the desire or the drivers to collect this data are as follows. There's actually pressure from FDA, who are now essentially saying, look, if you can collect this data, really you should. It's standard of care. And I think they would even go as far as to say, you know, you can't really submit data on an obesity trial or a diabetes trial without deploying an activity tracker. I think that doesn't make any sense. And I think really broadly the industry is saying, really, sleep and activity are such great measures of overall well-being. We really should be deploying these things because the data is of such high quality and it is of such interest. And we're actually seeing pressure, so it's a positive pressure from FDA, I would say. On the other hand, we're actually seeing providers and payers saying, well, we're not going to reimburse for a procedure or the implantation of a device or a new drug if you can't show me that that drug is improving a person's quality of life, be that their activity or their ability to engage in activity, or just their ability to sleep and whether their sleep is getting better or not. So we're seeing positive pressure from FDA, positive pressure from the payers, if you like, the reimbursement side, and we're also seeing a positive pressure from the consumers who want to be engaged in their own healthcare and getting the best data that they can, or providing the best data that they can in a clinical trial. In terms of partnerships, we're actually seeing the evolution of data standards across the industry, and this is a very, very important industry-wide phenomenon that is happening right now, in that we're all seeking the ability to look at this data in a very level playing field. We want to understand that the data is being analyzed in the same way, no matter what sensor it comes from, or indeed what algorithms we apply to it. So there's intense scrutiny around data standards in the industry. And actually, I was at one of the most interesting meetings of my career. Actually, I was invited 2 weeks ago to go to the American Academy of Sciences in DC, Albert Einstein's statue outside. And there was a group of invited industry, pharmaceutical industry participants, a number of providers like Medidata, discussing data standards for the industry. But there were only 40 people invited to that meeting. It was actually run by the Critical Path Institute, or CDISC, and the FDA sent 10 individuals to that meeting. And so that gives you an idea of the kind of resources that FDA is bringing to bear on these questions. I think it's indicative of their enthusiasm level and their willingness to engage the industry broadly to implement best practices and standards. So it's really wonderful to see, and I say this to all of our customers coming to this perhaps for the first time. The FDA is your friend in this endeavor, and they are as excited about this data as you are, and they will collaborate and be very consultative in that role. The other thing that I like to tell people, just as a data point in terms of the regulatory environment, if you go to clinicaltrials.gov and you put in some search terms like activity tracker, or even put in a commercial name like Fitbit or Garmin, you will actually get a large number of hits. And so we're seeing many clinical trials. I think the last time I looked, it was about 370 clinical trials, either underway or enrolling, that include activity trackers or some kind of wearable sensor. So industry is moving in that direction. FDA is right behind us, working with us, and the payers are there too.
So do you think that by, the FDA's coming on board and really wanting this type of data, do you see that clinical trials will get shorter in periods of time with the ability to collect data on a more 24/7 type of basis? Or do you think that the clinical trials are going to continue to last, 3, 5, 7, 10 years?
Well, I think the length of the clinical trials may depend on other factors, but I definitely see the advantage of collecting large amounts of data means that potentially you can look at changes in biomarkers or changes in the endpoint that you're looking at that may actually be occurring much more quickly if you weren't able to look for that signature in the data using a wearable sensor. So I can see this shortening trials, enhancing the richness of the data that we're getting from these clinical trials. But one expectation that I think is maybe a little ahead of the curve is, these solutions are often still quite expensive to deploy for reasons perhaps other than just the sensors. The data analytics can be expensive. And so the idea that this deployment of wearable sensors and data analytics is going to radically reduce cost in clinical trials is perhaps getting a little bit ahead of ourselves. But I think as the algorithms that interrogate data improve and are able to auto-score data much more quickly, I think we will actually see considerable cost reduction in the system. And it's actually the development of those algorithms, which is one of Medidata's key offerings, but is also one of the most intense areas of interest in the industry, be it consumer healthcare or clinical trials right now.
So I have one final question for you, and that is, do you wear a wearable?
Yes, I do. I'm going to sidestep that question a little bit as well, because I'm not supposed to make product endorsements. But you know what? It seems like we all have a wearable sensor now, and that is my cell phone, my smartphone, which never is too far away from me, apart from when I'm surfing, I think is the only time I really take it off. But it seems that the cell phone or the smartphone is kind of the nexus of all of this information. We're actually seeing sensors that plug directly into your cell phone. We're actually doing a trial at Medidata. It's been widely publicized with GlaxoSmithKline called the Parade study. And that's a rheumatoid arthritis study in which data is being collected on an app which is specifically asking questions about rheumatoid arthritis. But then the patients in the clinical trial actually use their phone to collect data on how they walk or how they move and how dexterous they are with this RA condition. So we're literally actually seeing sensors being plugged into our phones, but actually the phones themselves being the sensor. So I think the smartphone is going to increasingly be the point at which we perhaps plug in a high-resolution sensor like an EKG, but is also the hub via which we transmit data, be that glucometry data or blood pressure data or other types of data.
So, and I understand you don't want to solicit anyone in particular wearable. What type of data are you most interested in collecting for yourself? What are you looking at as far as sleep? Are you looking at, the amount of movement that you make?
Well, I consider myself a pretty active. I'm fortunate enough to be an active person and do love to walk, do love to surf, as I mentioned, and do sort of physical activities. However, if I can see one thing about my health, and I think I've come back to it so many times, sleep quality, very capable of being measured by a relatively simple sensor. We can add in more complicated sensors if we want to see more detail about our sleep. But if I wanted to know just one thing about myself, it would be, is my quality of sleep improving or not improving? Mm-hmm. Well, I'd like to take you up on that point about activity. Mm-hmm. And for me, it's this basic. I mean, when we pick up the phone and we talk to our mother or a loved one or somebody we care about, what is it that we ask? What did you do today? And so that is a question about activity. We don't want to think about our loved ones or somebody close to us sitting on a couch doing nothing. We want them to be active. We want to think of them engaged in life. And so just that ability to see, indeed, somebody was more active than they were the day before because of a clinical intervention is so fundamental to our well-being and really so easy to capture that I think we're at a tipping point where I think we'll see these kinds of measures of activity and sleep and others in every single clinical trial that we conduct in the future and in every healthcare setting too. One of the main concerns or one of the main questions that I am asked about wearable sensors, particularly around activity and sleep, is, I think there are now over 100 types of activity trackers available just in the consumer space. There are probably another 200 wearable sensors in the space. So, I mean, there has been a tremendous explosion of those sensors in the best possible sense. But people are often concerned, how accurate are sensors? And we're actually seeing a number of publications that are coming out where entities or healthcare entities or just researchers are comparing very large numbers of sensors of different brands, if you like, to one another. And essentially the consensus is that although each sensor may calculate the number of steps or the exact number of calories that you burn in a slightly different way, those sensors are more or less accurate even when we compare them one to another. And so the choice between having no data versus having this rich data set because you have very small concerns about the pure accuracy of it, I think is not a reason to jump in wholeheartedly into this sort of wearable space conversation.
Thank you, Patrick Hankey of Medidata, for joining us here today. To listen to more podcasts about HealthMed Wearables, visit us at HealthMedWearables.com.